Please welcome Katha Pollitt.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. This is my first conference of this sort, and it's very exciting. I'm learning so much from Amanda Marcotte and Rebecca Goldstein, the two people I got to hear yesterday, and also from this wonderful panel here this morning, which was really an eye-opener for me. I just want to, before I start, I want to answer the question, how did I become an atheist at 6? My cousin Wendy and I were at her house in the suburbs, and this was a newly built, very flat development, which is now very leafy and beautiful and expensive. But then it was kind of bleak. And we were standing by the fence, and we were looking at the sunset. And I thought, you know, Wendy believes that this beautiful sunset was put here by God, but I know that isn't true. And that was it. It just came to me. And it's true, as you go through life, I'm sure you've all had, there's the aesthetic justification for God, right? That we live in this beautiful world, and there's the sunset, and we have art, and where does it come from, if not from God? And that has always seemed to me a very poor argument for the belief in God. Because if there was no God, it's not like the world with the sunsets wouldn't happen, right? I mean, it just makes no sense. It's just a sentimental bit of claptrap. Anyway, my topic is sexism and religion. Can the knot be untied? And as I stood up from the audience, Sarah Posner, who I was sitting next to and who's live tweeting this whole thing, said, "I don't envy you your topic." And it is true that I chose the title of my talk today because I wanted to think about a question to which I didn't know the answer. Can religion, currently existing religions, that is, be disentangled from the misogyny of its texts, its traditions, and its practices? And I started my research by asking a random selection of people what they thought. Cousin Wendy, who fasts on Yom Kippur, and I don't know if she believes in God. That whole side of my family, they practice Judaism a little bit, but they never quite, with Judaism, it doesn't really matter so much if you believe in God. It's the practices are what matter. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. Okay, so Cousin Wendy said no. Religion cannot be disentangled from misogyny, and so did Cousin Penny, the lapsed Greek Orthodoxer. And so did my daughter, who has been a militant atheist since kindergarten. And the literary critic Daniel Mendelsohn, who I admire very much, tweeted, "Not as long as God is the Father." And that was pretty much how it went, even down to the Dublin taxi driver who told me that he thought people could get along perfectly fine without religion and probably would be doing so before long. And so, coming from Dublin, I don't think 20 years ago you would have found an ordinary person who would have said that. But the child abuse scandal and modernization in general have really changed that country a lot. Well, we all know that the world's major religions are deeply shaped by patriarchal ideas about women's place, and we saw that in the last panel. We had some really fascinating testimonies to that. For some religions that extends even into the next world. Mormon men may have to practice monogamy in this life, and we feel very sorry for them about that. But after death, they will have many wives, while a woman can only enter the afterlife if her husband calls her there by her secret name. He and she know her secret name, but she doesn't know his secret name. So he has a big advantage over her. Plus, get this, she will be perpetually pregnant in the afterlife. This is so horrible. In order to produce people to populate her husband's planet, because he gets a planet after he dies. Okay, so this is not exactly any woman's idea of heaven, I think. In the Islamic afterlife, men get a bevy of beautiful maidens. And in some versions, their wives get to be part of this entourage. And in other versions, they get, something wonderful, but no one knows what it is. You'll have to die and find out. But other religions, Christianity, for example, preach that men and women are equal before God, equal spiritually, whatever that means. In Galatians, for example, St. Paul famously wrote, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And Jesus himself said that after the resurrection, there would be no marriage and no pregnancy either. You'll be relieved to know. but whether they believed in an egalitarian heaven or not, the guidelines laid out for human society on earth tend to be quite a different story, including in Christianity, of course. After all, St. Paul also famously wrote, "Let the women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but let them subject themselves, just as the law also says. And if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church." And that's a very famous passage from Corinthians. Now, I'll get back to it in a bit, but for now, I'll just observe that whether you look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism, wherever a distinction of sex is made, it is to the advantage of men. If you think of religions as if they were novels, the authors are men, and so are the major characters. There is no daughter of God like Jesus. There is no female prophet like Isaiah or Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad said you can't have a female prophet. No lawgiver equal to Moses. No female founder of a major new faith like the Buddha, although Christian Science and a few others were founded by women. And very few female religious leaders with independent power. Catholicism has many female saints and charismatic women. But the most insignificant parish priest has powers denied, the genius, St. Teresa. Only a man can officiate at Mass. Only a man can give absolution for sins. Even polytheistic religions like Hinduism, or for that matter, ancient Greek and Roman religion, assign goddesses a lesser role. To find a woman-centered religion, you have to go back to prehistory, to mother goddess cults about which we know little, and which in any case cannot be proven to have reflected or shaped a matriarchal society in which women were powerful and independent social actors, although it would be nice to think that. Men, after all, are quite capable of worshiping a female, whether Lakshmi or Athena or the Virgin Mary, while vigorously repressing actual human women. So look at the major texts, and what do you see? A farrago of misogyny, menstrual taboos, double standards of sexuality in which religiously sanctioned polygyny is only the most obvious, a deep concern with controlling women's sexuality expressed as an obsession with prostitutes, with ensuring virginity and fidelity, and with women's modesty, with false charges of rape, which show up in the Bible in famous stories like the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and much, much more. Even Jesus, who was one of the more women-friendly religious leaders, forbade divorce except when a wife, not a husband, a wife, had been unfaithful. And that's very interesting when you think of his own family history, because Joseph had considered sending Mary back to her parents when she was found to be pregnant by another. The atheist in me wants to answer my question with a resounding no. Misogyny not only pervades the major faiths, it's baked in. I'd go further and suggest that the subordination of women has historically been one of the main purposes of religion. It's the original rule book for patriarchy. To the extent that religion has become more woman-friendly, it's because the larger society has become so. Thus, today, many, if not most, priests and rabbis and imams tend to talk in the softer language of complementarity. Men and women are equal. They're just different. And surprise, they're different in ways that justify giving men power over women. And just turned out that way. And barring women from exercising power in most realms of human activity. If you go back a few hundred years, though, nobody bothered about separate but equal spheres. That was a Victorian idea. Women were inferior and subordinate, and that was how it was. Men's job was to control women's wanton, lascivious ways and their low cunning, to resist their seductions as Adam should have resisted Eve, and remember, everything is Eve's fault. Women's sexuality was not just different, it was dangerous and potentially polluting, and therefore had to be confined and channeled in a way that men's sexuality did not have to be. Today, however, you would have a hard time, though, finding a rabbi who would say the reasoning behind the menstrual taboo in Judaism is that menstruation is just unclean and disgusting. No, no. The ritual bath is a way of regulating sexual intercourse that makes it more meaningful and that empowers and honors women. Oh, please. Oh, please. And here, I have to tell you a story that illustrates this so well. My former husband, Randy Cohen, was the original ethicist at the New York Times Sunday magazine. And every week he wrote a column which was a very popular feature, answering people's ethical questions. So a woman wrote in and she said, well, I'm a real estate broker and, maybe she was selling her house. And she found a real estate broker who was an Orthodox Jew. And he wouldn't shake hands with her. And she found this very disturbing. She found that it was as if he was demeaning her. And so she asked my former husband if it was okay for her to have these feelings and to not employ him. And Randy said, yes, it's fine. It's very insulting, and you shouldn't have to put up with this. Well, this was the most infuriating and controversial column he wrote after the column that said, no, you cannot take the little toiletries that they put in your hotel room. That was unbelievably, people were up in arms about that for years. They want you to take those things. Anyway, so he almost lost his job because of this, and he had to have a meeting with a whole bunch of Orthodox Jews, and in order to sort of smooth things over. And the Orthodox Jews said, this has nothing to do with women being unclean, with any kind of taboo or pollution. This is about modesty and respect. And it's just as much incumbent on women as on men. It's very egalitarian. We just think the sexes shouldn't be so quick to, touch each other. So they've sort of reframed it in their mind, at least at the superficial, let's talk to the New York Times level, as being about something, that's kind of okay, and that isn't a specific resistance to women. Okay, so, but getting back to my main theme, when American Muslim women talk about why they wear the hijab or other covering, and this is very interesting. I read some Muslim women blogs, and they go on and on about the hijab as a symbol of religious identity. It is not a portable purdah that keeps male strangers from being inflamed with lust. And a lot of young Muslim women are starting to wear the hijab, and their mother didn't. So it's their own decision, and this is the way they express their religion, and it's a marker of who they are, and it's all great. And it has nothing to do with sexism. Now, in the US, it's very hard to find a woman who would say there's anything demeaning or controlling about this. And I discovered this after 9/11, when some very well-meaning leftists suggested that non-Muslim women wear the headscarf to show solidarity with Muslim women who were being harassed on the streets. This was along the lines of the Danes, who, under German occupation in World War II, wore the yellow star to protect their nation's Jews. And my suggestion was that maybe men should wear the headscarf. And that did not go over well. I did not understand. Okay. So today there's a whole industry of feminist and progressive-minded theologians who apply their tremendous scholarly skills to reinterpreting the Bible and the Quran too in more egalitarian ways. And the atheist in me finds this sort of revisionism really irritating. It seems like a kind of cheating after almost 2,000 years, in which it was perfectly clear to everyone that St. Paul meant women should be silent in church when he said women should be silent in church. Suddenly, it seems he didn't really mean that. He meant women should behave a bit more circumspectly in church. And maybe only in that one congregation in Corinth he was addressing in that particular letter, where maybe there was some problem with women going completely wild. And maybe, indeed, he didn't even write that letter. Maybe it was just all a big mistake. You can take this kind of exegesis very far, and you can historicize away and reinterpret away pretty much anything that doesn't fit modern liberal values. To give one example, some scholars see as a major obstacle to the modernization of Islam and to a possible Islamic Reformation along the lines of the Protestant Reformation, the belief that the Quran was given directly from God to Muhammad. It's just the one text. Unlike the Bible, which is an edited conglomeration of texts from different times and places and different layers of authorship. But I've met Muslim feminists who don't see any of that as a problem. They simply argue that it's obvious. Everything objectionable in the Quran relates only to Muhammad's own time and is not binding in our own, and everything good and inspiring in it is an eternal truth. It's very simple. And the same thing has been going on in Christianity and Judaism for 100 years and more. It's left to religious skeptics and atheists, and I realize there's a difference. There are skeptics, there are atheists, there are secular humanists, but I don't know what the difference between a skeptic and an atheist is. You'll have to tell me afterwards. So, as I said, this is my first time at this gathering, I don't want to tread on any toes. So it's left to skeptics and atheists to ask why God put his word in such a way that up until the day before yesterday, he was believed to have been saying one thing pretty clearly in a way that everybody understood, from school children up to the most sophisticated religious leaders, and that was hardly questioned at all. But now it's just seen as a historical curiosity or a misreading. The Bible is supposed to be divinely inspired, after all, and the Quran is supposed to be the direct word of God that Muhammad was only the secretary of. If it turns out that so much of these texts that was taken to be divine truth is really just a narrow comment on something contemporary to the time of writing, or a misinterpretation, or a mistake, or even a typo, why do we think the other bits are so divine or full of wisdom? Why are these books the books we should look to for guidance on everything from workers' rights to what to have for dinner? To the atheist in me, all this reinterpretation might be great fun as literary criticism. To every age, its own version of scriptures and myths, just as every age has its own Hamlet or its own Othello. Literary criticism has long accepted, indeed delighted, in the instability of meaning. But to take it seriously as what was always in the text seems like changing the rules rather late in the game. Shakespeare, after all, could only write like an Elizabethan. He only knew what was then known. But God is all-powerful and omniscient. He could have had his stable of authors say anything. He could have given the 10 Commandments to Miriam instead of Moses and made one of them, "Thou shalt have no inequality between men and women." Instead, he not only spent 4 of the 10 Commandments stressing the importance of worshiping himself exclusively, he addressed the commandments explicitly to men. "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife." No gender-neutral language there. And he mentioned said wife along with farm animals and real estate. God did not need to do that. He didn't have to talk like some cranky old Hebrew patriarch. He is God. Yet, for some strange reason, he chose mysteriously to speak exactly as if he belonged to the society in which his books were written. As ignorant, as prejudiced, as superstitious, and as sexist as anyone else at that time. And what this means is that feminist theologians have their work cut out for them. They must pare away the thick layers of misogyny in their faiths, while simultaneously demonstrating that these layers can be carted off like the detritus of an archaeological dig, leaving only what is pure and essential and original, which just happens to coincide with the things enlightened liberals believe today. The cranky old Hebrew patriarch turns out to be a wise old McGovernich, after all. Now, some of this research is undeniably fascinating. For instance, scholarly work on the position of women in the early Christian church shows that they did have far more ecclesiastical responsibility than has been generally believed, and that later generations altered texts that showed this. The apostle Junias, for example, mentioned in St. Paul, was actually a female apostle, Junia. Junia, the female apostle. Medieval scholars just knew that had to be a typo, so they fixed it. People today are hungry for a Christianity that is woman positive and sex positive. And that's why the Da Vinci Code, a terrible book, the worst, but that's why it was such a huge success. We love the idea that the original church was a wonderful egalitarian place, that Jesus was married or at least had a girlfriend, and that this original wonderfulness was erased from history by evil, sexist, celibate men. But there's only so far you can go with this kind of historical revisionism. You can use all the inclusive language you want and refer to God as our parent, I've seen this, as he or she, or even no pronoun at all, but simply repeating God instead every time you would have a pronoun, and that is really awkward and ugly. I'm not willing to go that far for feminism. You can beef up the role of women in the Bible, a practice that is as old as Christianity itself, because in the actual texts, Mary is only a moderately important character. She only shows up in a few crucial scenes. She's hardly the quasi-divine figure who is so central to Catholicism. That all was added on later. You can add Miriam's cup to the items on the Seder table, but although it only has water in it. It's very disappointing. Elijah gets wine, Miriam gets water, her cup is smaller. But at the end of the day, Miriam is no Moses, God is still a father, not a mother, and Jesus is still a man and not a woman. The New Testament is still the old familiar story of the hero born of a male God and a human woman who is sacrificed for human sins, and it's all our fault. Well, Eve's fault, actually. It's still male sky versus female earth, immortal versus mortal, superior versus inferior, mind versus body, active versus passive. The old set of dichotomies that has always been used to exalt the male over the female. Christianity still has its obsession with virginity and sexual self-denial that has been so harmful to men and to women in particular. Hostility to sex was part of its original Roman Empire brand. That was how, the Roman Empire was just drenched in sex. And the Christians were the ones who said, no sex, no sex. And that made them stand out and was probably a relief to some people. Sort of, phew, glad that's over with. But you can't really derive our contemporary gender egalitarian, gay-friendly, hedonistic, sexual mores from the New Testament, at least not if you were honest. And yet some Christian theologians do exactly that. But wait, there's another way to look at this question of sexism and religion. We atheists get mad when it looks to us as if the goalposts are constantly moving. Now you say there's nothing wrong with women wearing pants. That wasn't what you said when you were burning Joan of Arc at the stake. But haven't the goalposts always been moving? Hasn't religion changed and adapted and split and reorganized itself constantly throughout its history? Judaism, after the destruction of the temple, became a whole different thing. Islam in Indonesia is not Islam in Saudi Arabia. When Europe was ruled by kings and queens, the church underwrote monarchy as part of God's plan, and Jesus himself was described as the King of Kings. Nowadays, you'd look crazy to invoke the Bible against democratic government. The founding fathers read the Bible as an endorsement of the American Revolution. So what we see, or I see, as the intellectually disreputable moving of goalposts can be described in another way. Religion changes when society changes. Well, maybe 50 years after society changes. But Marx said that. He said there's consciousness lags behind material circumstances. Okay, so that process only looks dishonest if you think religion is a set of fixed texts and rules and traditions. And I would suggest that's how many of us atheists tend to see it. But you can also see religion sociologically. And seen in that light, religion is not really about the proper analysis of texts and traditions. It's a social practice that reflects the larger society in all kinds of complicated ways. The real object of worship is society itself. I'm taking a line from kind of dumbed-down Durkheim there. Religious practices are a way that a community reaffirms and asserts their common project, their oneness. As society changes, as it always has and always will, people naturally sift through the immense grab bag of religious texts and traditions, and they pick out the bits that make their world make sense, that make it seem as if everything is the way it's supposed to be, or alternately, as if everything is all wrong, but could be made right with the proper religious understanding. Religions themselves don't put it like that, of course. They have to maintain that there's a direct line going back to the beginning, that, for example, because that's where their authority comes from. For example, St. Peter, they have to maintain, was a pope in the same sense that Pope Francis I is one, although this could not possibly be true, given that Christianity itself was not a codified religion in the 1st century AD. It had no formal hierarchy for someone to be the head of, and according to Gary Wills, it didn't even have any priests. This constant rewriting of history, while never admitting that that's what's happening, is part of the process by which religions claim a moral weight and power that transcends time, while actually they are totally enmeshed in the present. As the anthropologist Roy Rappaport put it, to invest social conventions with sanctity is to hide their arbitrariness in a cloak of seeming necessity. That need for seeming necessity explains why religious liberals and reactionaries both look to the past for justification, to some imaginary earlier day when their own values held sway. Thus, Judaism is inherently socialist. I know so many people who believe this. It's just ridiculous. Jesus was a pacifist, and Mohammed was a feminist, and we must get back to that original vision. Or, Jesus came not to bring peace but a sword. He said so himself. God gave the West Bank to the Jewish people, and cutting off the hands of thieves is fine because that's what they did in 7th century Arabia. And that's the original vision we need to recoup. So where does this all leave our knot? Can it be untied? Well, in theory, sure. As society changes, religion eventually accommodates it, however grudgingly and belatedly. After all, the Bible used to be cited as a justification for slavery. A whole new denomination, the Southern Baptists, was formed to defend it. But nobody looks at the Bible now and says, you know, we should really bring back slavery. That's truly the biblical way to live. Similarly, for centuries, Christianity justified burning women as witches. And the book of Exodus does say, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And the Wiccans are very mad about that. They feel this is a real mistranslation because a witch is a good, life-affirming pagan who is very connected with nature. And surely the Bible would not be saying, you must burn these good, nature-loving people. So a witch is something else, according to them. But it says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. But nobody, at least in the West, pays much attention to that now because we don't believe in witchcraft. The whole concept of witches and witch burning has long been discarded. So far, I've been talking about religion as though believers are being dragged along by feminism and liberalism into modifying its former harshness, even as believers resist openly acknowledging that process as we atheists would like them to do. And this is what the modernization theory would predict. And that's the theory that as human society progresses, people abandon religion, or alternatively, religion becomes a pale, reasonable shadow of its former crazy self. But obviously, that happy, if somewhat self-deceptive process of liberalization is not the only thing going on in the world of religion. Right now, reactionary religious movements are gaining strength, and doing so while ferociously resisting modern roles for women. That's sort of the banner project, like no sex was for the early Christians. Now it's, down with women for the modern fundamentalist movements. And we see this in many faiths around the world. So does the rise of fundamentalism prove the modernization theory wrong? Does it show us that not only can the knot not be untied, but that large numbers of people think the problem is it needs to be tied even tighter? I have to say, I'm still fond of the modernization theory. I see fundamentalist revivals as a testament to the lack of modernity, to the unequal sharing of its benefits, to new risks and insecurities and injustices, which are bound up with nationalism, lack of democracy, and of course the natural desire of whoever is on top, in this case priests, sheiks, men, to preserve their hereditary privileges. Everybody wants to keep what they have. And here I want to complicate what seems to me a perhaps too blithe assumption that religion is the main thing holding back women's equality. Fundamentalism is a vehicle for patriarchy, but that doesn't mean that if people dumped religion, they would become feminists. The French Revolution was made by men of the Enlightenment who were ferociously anti-clerical, but their world-shaking revolution did nothing for women's rights. In fact, by the time it was all over, women were kind of a little worse off than before, legally. The Soviet Union and Communist China both liberated women from all sorts of traditional restrictions, but only insofar as it suited the state, which remained firmly in the hands of men. Thus, Lenin made abortion illegal, but Stalin, who wanted to raise the birth rate, made it a crime. And when it was legalized again, it was without provision for birth control, subjecting women to repeated brutal operations because so what? They were just women. And the state had more important things to produce in its mighty factories. You can be good without God, and you can also be sexist without God. In our own time, we've seen any number of pseudoscientific justifications for women's subordination, evolutionary psychology, for example. So, to sum up, when the happy day comes that women's equality is a given that underlies and pervades society through and through, that knot will be untied. Miraculously, the Bible will be seen to have always promoted it. Eve will no longer be the weak-minded temptress. She'll be the far-seeing feminist who chose knowledge over obedience and got us out of that boring old garden. The whole religion will be reframed, the nasty bits explained away or forgotten. It won't be an entirely honest project, to my way of thinking at least, but for those who want to believe in God and be part of a congregation, it will be good enough. Indeed, this has already happened to a certain extent. As barriers fall in the secular world and women take on occupations and responsibilities once barred to them, religious restrictions stick out more. It used to just be one among so many things. It looks very strange today to say a woman can do anything a man can do, except be a Catholic priest. But there is the other side. Not everyone is persuaded. The more feminist and progressive the mainline denominations become, the smaller they get. This is often explained by, for example, Ross Douthat, as of the New York Times, who's my special bête noire, as the result of these old line denominations like Episcopalianism and Methodism and Presbyterianism drift away from the hard religious truths into namby-pamby ecumenicism, and they put liberal pieties over genuine spirituality. I have a different interpretation. I would say these denominations draw on well-educated urban middle class or higher folk who are becoming less and less religious and eventually fall away completely. For booming congregations and real enthusiasm, though, the energy is with conservative denominations, especially the various sorts of born-again Christians. For these people, religion is a bulwark against too rapid social change, especially in gender and family relations. They get too much from their church or synagogue to give it up. Practical help with very real problems, a social network, a sense of belonging and mattering, Rebecca Goldstein's wonderful concept from yesterday. Mattering to others, mattering to God. God is the ultimate friend. The ongoing drama of sin and redemption in daily life is probably really exciting. Suddenly, every action, every thought is part of a great drama in which Jesus and Satan are fighting over you. Great. For women, that church we deride as sexist and reactionary may be an arena in which they get to take on a public role denied them in the rest of life. If you live in a thoroughly sexist culture, as much of America still is, calling yourself a helpmeet who cheerfully submits may not feel as discordant as it does to us, especially if the alternative is social isolation, as we saw in the panel. So you reframe it. I submit to my husband, but in return, he has to love me and be a good father and come home at night instead of drinking with his friends. For some women, that's not such a bad bargain. After all, Nietzsche famously described Christianity as the religion of women and slaves, a clever way in which the weak got the strong to give up their power. When the weak become strong in real life, that dynamic changes. So I guess what I'm giving is a somewhat paradoxical answer to the question of the knot of sexism and religion. It can be untied to the precise extent that religion becomes less important and less necessary. But by the time that happens and the knot is finally untied, no one will care. Okay, thank you very much.